Now we're going to move straight on to an economist's view. I was told that the definition of an optimist is somebody who doesn't have all the facts. Economists tend to have more facts than most of us. They tend to be really rather pessimistic. I hope you might be the exception. I'm standing over here, by the way, just to give your necks a chance to face a different way, because you've been looking over that way for a little while, so I just thought I'd mix it about a bit. So over to you, Thomas Pugh from RSM. Give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back. Peter, before you go, just checking, you don't have your notes about everything that I predicted last year on you, do you?
Don't worry, you're like a weather forecast.
Good.
It's all bollocks, but we've forgotten it.
In that case, everything I said is completely true and is all 100% accurate. So, where to start? Normally, I don't start here, but I think it's really relevant for this group particularly to start essentially with where we are now. Because I do a lot of this kind of thing. I go up and down the country, talking to lots of businesses, nowhere near as well put together and as glamorous as HOSPACE, but, and we say, right, the economy, the first half of this year, has been booming. It's been great, and kind of I get looked at like I've got three heads a lot of the time. So where are we? What's been going on? And essentially, this is what's happened. Household income, the money in people's pockets, which is that green line, has grown really strongly in the first half of this year, and actually since 2023, really. The problem is they haven't been spending it. So that consumer spending line is flat, essentially. So that means even though the economy looks like it's doing really well, consumer spending has been really stagnant. So if you're in an industry which is relying on consumer spending, actually it doesn't feel like it's been that good, especially because, well, when we look at where consumer spending has been rising, it's been on necessity stuff. So it's been on food, housing, health, education. It's not been on the kind of fun stuff. We've not been spending very much on clothes, on going out, restaurants, etc., etc. So that's why even though the GDP figures look pretty good, a lot of people in the hospitality industry especially aren't feeling like they're seeing a lot of that benefit. And just remember this kind of story because it will come back later. It's going to be a running theme through the thing. The other thing to talk about, I guess, if we're not too sick of it, is the budget. My colleagues back at RSM have put out some really good stuff on how the budget impacts the hospitality industry. I get to think big picture. So the three key takeaways from the budget for the economy, for me, are really it's expansionary. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, we get more spending into the economy than we get taken out in taxes. So you can see those bars at the top are a lot bigger than the bars at the bottom, especially in the first couple of years. So this year, next year, going into 2026. The way to think about it is essentially you get a sugar rush of spending coming to the economy next year. That boosts growth. So next year looks pretty good. You also, though, get an increase in inflation because you're pumping lots and lots of money into the economy. You're not bringing any more people into work. You're not doing that with the supply side. So you get an increase in inflation as well. You put those two things together, stronger GDP growth, higher inflation means interest rates will fall more slowly, as Mark mentioned earlier. It doesn't mean they don't fall at all. It just means they fall by a little bit less than we were thinking previously. So that kind of sets the stage for where we are. I guess it's time for me to stick my neck out now and do some forecasting. So, inflation. Below 2% now. It's not going to stay there. It'll get back to 3%-ish by the end of the year. It'll probably bobble around 2.5% to 3% for 2025. And then from 2026, it starts to come back down. That's unhelpful. It's not great. We'd much rather it be at 2%. But we're not going back to that kind of, cost of living crisis, the 10, 11, 12% rates that we saw previously. This is 2, 3%. It's not a disaster. The other important fact is services inflation, which is what crucially matters for interest rates, will continue to trend down. So just because we get this increase in inflation this year into 2025, it doesn't mean that interest rates won't fall. So we get that as well. Crucially, I think for everybody in this room as well, when we look at food and beverage inflation, that looks pretty flat based on commodity prices. So we get an increase in headline inflation, but that doesn't mean that everything is going up all at the same rate all the time. Food and beverage inflation should stay pretty mild after we've been through this big, horrible cycle. So hopefully that's slightly more optimistic for everyone here. Crucially for the outlook for inflation, though, especially services inflation and interest rates, is the labour market. So this chart, we've just got a couple of measures of how we're doing. Employment, it's been pretty poor, to be honest. It's only just got back to its pre-pandemic level. In the hospitality industry, still employing significantly less people than before the pandemic. Now, you have to take these with a pinch of salt, or actually quite a big handful of salt, because the way the ONS gets this data is still pretty old school. It rings up 40, 50,000 people a month and says, you employed, where do you work, et cetera, et cetera. What they've found is actually, since the pandemic at least, nobody answers the phone to a random number on a work day anymore. Those that do tend to be unemployed, retired, et cetera, et cetera. So it's playing havoc with the data. Take it with a pinch of salt. But broadly, looking at everything combined, the labour market is pretty stable at the minute. We've gone through the real period of tightness. It's loosened off. It's about stable. We're not expecting a really big increase in the unemployment rate. We're not expecting it to fall very much either. One of the big issues, though, is that we've had a massive increase in what we call economic inactivity. So that is basically people who don't want a job, they're not looking for a job, they've completely dropped out of the economy. Increase of almost 1 million. Almost all of those people have dropped out because they say they're too sick to work. Now, this has a big implication for the economy because, well, when you break it down, an economy is how many people have you got working, how much they work, and how much they produce. So if you have lost almost 1 million people out of your workforce, and there's 33 million people employed in the UK, so you've lost 2-3%, that's a big drag on growth. It matters for the government because instead of these people working, paying taxes, you're having to pay them benefits. So it's a big drag on the fiscal issue. And it should matter, I think, for everybody here, because when we break this down, essentially you can divide it in half. Half is over 50s, half is under 25s. So if you're looking to kind of employ those junior people, waiters, et cetera, well, actually, this is where they've all gone. A lot of them have dropped out of the workforce. And unfortunately, the risk is, when we look historically, we see once you've dropped out that workforce because you're too sick, it's very difficult to get people back into work. So the risk is that the employment market, it just remains a lot tighter than it should do because we've just lost these people and we can't get them back in. So that's one thing to think about. We've seen plenty of browsing the stalls outside, stuff about AI, automation. It's an ongoing theme that we at RSM are talking about because we just don't think you're going to get a big increase in availability of labour. So we've got to think about how we get around that, especially when you think about the demographics. We know that they're terrible. So I think that's one ongoing theme as well. The consequence of a relatively tight labour market, though, is that wage growth has been high. So we've seen Actually, we've seen wage growth come off quite nicely. You'll see that spike there. Essentially, that is those public sector pay deals that we saw announced at the start of the government, those 6, 7, 8%, they push at the headline rate. And then it starts to fall quite gradually, well, quite steeply, depending on your point of view, over 2025. Now, the logic, the thinking here, especially from like the OBR, who do all the government's homework, is that once we get into the second half of next year, firms really start trying to recoup those costs that they incurred in the budget, so those NICs charges, et cetera, by passing on lower wage growth to employees. So essentially, you get a £25 billion increase in businesses' costs in April, or when they come in. Firms try and pass that on to the workers, so you get a £25 billion, essentially, decrease in wage growth compared to what it otherwise would have been. You combine that with the increase in inflation that we get, and actually, by the time we get into 2026, real wages, which are what we should all really care about, because that is the measure of living standards, it's the measure of how much stuff you can buy, real wages look like they barely grow at all in 2026. So 2024 has been pretty good. 2025 will be solid. But as we move into 2026 and 2027, that's where the risks are, I feel, from this point of view. So, coming on to interest rates, the blue line is where we were the day before the budget. The green line is where we are now, effectively. So again, you can see still falling, just not quite as steeply as before. Base case is, unfortunately, we probably don't get a rate cut in December now. We were expecting one, but I think the budget's kind of killed that off. We get 1.25 next year. It was 1 a meeting, now 1.25. So by the time we get into 2025, interest rates are around 3 3/4. They probably settle 3.5, 3. So, it's similar kind of range, long-term range that we were expecting before. We just take a little bit longer to get there. One positive consequence, though, is the burden on consumers, on households of higher interest rates still falls. So this chart is just basically telling you the drag on consumer income from interest rates. We've gone past the peak. As we move forward, that burden gets smaller and smaller each quarter, so the drag becomes lower. So at this point, I'm going to ask you all to remember back to the first slide. Basically, what we've got, from a financial point of view at least, UK households, UK consumers are doing pretty well. Incomes are up. The burden from interest rates is falling. Real wages are rising. All of this is very positive. So, but why aren't we spending? They're saving. Households are still saving a fortune. So this is what we call the saving rate. It's the percentage of your income that you save every quarter. Before the pandemic, it was 5.5%. Now it's about 9%. The most recent data, it was above 10%. The difference between these two numbers is worth about £50 billion a year in spending to the economy. So a very big chunk of change, basically. The question is, when does this come down? It will come down. These are high numbers from a historic perspective. We're very confident they're going to fall. At some point, the question is when. And there's a bit of a saying in terms of give them a number or give them a date, but never give them both. So I'm a bit wary about bringing a date. But everything that we're looking at suggests that if we're not at peak saving, we're not far away from it. So as we move into 2025, 2026, saving ratio should fall. That helps consumers spend more. One of the things behind this is what we call the misery index. And to Peter's point, that we economists get a hard rap for being pessimistic and miserable, so we really lean into it with misery index. All this essentially does is say that consumer confidence is really related to those variables that consumers care about. So things like inflation, the unemployment rate, house prices. It's got a pretty good relationship, but what you'll see is, before the budget, consumer confidence tanked. Not related to anything fundamentally going on in the economy. So hopefully what we get is actually, now we've had the budget, the impact on workers hasn't been that bad. We should see that consumer confidence number rebound. And based on our forecasts, consumers, they get relatively less miserable over the period. And I think it was you, Peter, last year that said, is less miserable economists speak for happier. And actually, I think if you look at it, that consumer confidence number very rarely goes positive. It's almost always negative. UK consumers are pretty structurally miserable, I think. So I'll stick with less miserable for now. Hopefully we get positive at some point. So that's one of the reasons why we think consumers, that spending ratio will fall as consumers get more confident. So again, consumer confidence, when we look at the impact by incomes, it's actually those consumers on a lower income that have been hit the hardest. Higher income consumers, yeah, okay, it fell, but not by much at all. So even if we don't get a kind of big post-budget bounce, those higher income consumers are clearly more insulated and more confident, and that should drive consumer spending in that segment of the market. So, summing up essentially where we are. We've had that period of stagnation. We had the recession at the end of last year. The economy bounced back very strongly, like we talked about at the start. It's going to slow, but that's okay. When we think about economic growth, I like to think of it in terms of speed limits. The first half of this year, the UK economy was breaking its speed limit, its very low speed limit, really because we were kind of coming back, we were bouncing back from that recession. As we go forward, we just return to that more normal growth levels. So we're looking growth this year of a little bit over 1%. It's closer to 2% next year, 1.8 for those that like decimal points. And then we kind of go back to 1.5 for 2026, 27, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot better than the practically zero we've had over the last 5 years, but not huge amounts to shout about from an international perspective anyway. So that's where the outlook lies. But I'd be remiss not to talk about some of the risks. The most obvious one is what's going on in the Middle East. It's not difficult to see how something geopolitical happens and we get a big increase in energy prices. But I've specifically said risks lie in both directions here because actually the world is swimming in oil. There is a big surplus of oil out there. So if the opposite happens and tensions calm down in the Middle East, actually we will probably see some pretty big falls in oil prices. And that will support the kind of consumer spending, lower inflation story and help everything. The new Trump administration in the US, tariffs actually don't make a huge impact on the UK. Even if we get big tariffs, probably knocks 0.1% off GDP. Not something, it's not helpful, but it's not something we're really worried about. The bigger risk is that the combination of tariffs, a big fiscal expansion in the US, means you get stronger growth, higher inflation in the US. You then get higher interest rates over there. You get a stronger dollar, and that boosts inflation in the UK and actually globally. So the risk, I think, is that from the Trump perspective, we get a big increase in inflation, higher interest rates, a stronger dollar, and that increases inflation in the UK. The EU means lower real spending, means higher interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. But again, trying to do the risks lie in both directions, a stronger dollar and a stronger US consumer has pretty positive implications for global travel emanating from the US. So that's one potential upside. The last thing is really consumer spending. And again, this comes back to this point about consumer spending will rise, just when. We've just been through, at least 2 or 3 once-in-a-lifetime global shocks. Consumers may say, actually, I need a bigger savings pile before I'm willing to start spending again. So perhaps rather than the spending increase that we are expecting next year, maybe it doesn't come until second half of next year, the end of next year. So again, that is another risk. It's more of a timing thing. And that's me to go with 5 seconds. So,
Thomas Pugh, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to come over here again just to save your necks for another second.